Okay, we're 2 minutes out.
Morning, everybody. I'd like to call this open meeting of the FDIC Board to order. We need a sunshine motion.
So moved.
Thank you. And a second?
Second.
Thank you very much. All those in favor of the sunshine motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion is adopted. We have several items on the summary agenda this morning. Are there any questions or comments on any of the items on the summary agenda?
I'm going to vote in favor of the items on the summary agenda, but I'm just going to submit for the record a statement on the BSA proposal. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to submit it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And similarly, I'll support the summary agenda, and I'd like to include a statement for the record on the final rule on quality control standards for asset valuation models. If there are no other questions or comments on the summary agenda, may I have a motion to approve the summary agenda?
So moved.
And a second? Second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is adopted. We have two items on the discussion agenda today. The first is a final rule to strengthen resolution plan requirements for insured depository institutions under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. Betsy Falloon, Ryan Tetrick, Dora Douglas Kochman, Baronessa Marshall, and Celia Van Gorder will present the case. If they could please come forward.
Good morning. Chairman Grunberg and members of the board, for your consideration today, staff recommends the adoption of a final rule to amend and restate the existing Insured Depository Institution Resolution Plan rule. The current rule, which was finalized in 2012, requires resolution plans to be provided to the FDIC by insured depository institutions, or IDIs, with $50 billion or more in total assets. This final rule will incorporate lessons learned from past plan reviews and past bank resolutions, and will meaningfully improve the FDIC's readiness to handle future large bank failures with reduced cost and increased orderliness. This final rulemaking follows a notice of proposed rulemaking that was approved by the board last August and published for comment in the Federal Register on September 19th, 2023. The FDIC received 12 written comments and held 2 meetings with commenters at their request. Staff reviewed and carefully analyzed all comments, and the final rule being considered today reflects a number of changes to the proposal while retaining many of its key features. Today, I will touch on some of those features of the rule and the targeted improvements made to the proposal. The final rule would retain the scope of the current rule in that it would apply to all IDIs with $50 billion or more in total assets. It would create 2 categories of covered IDIs, or CIDIs, an approach that was introduced in the proposal. The first group, the Group A CIDIs, consists of IDIs with at least $100 billion in total assets. These would be required to submit full resolution plans. The second group, the Group B CIDIs, consists of IDIs with at least $50 billion in total assets, but less than $100 billion. And these IDIs would be required to submit limited content informational filings. Similar to the proposed rule, the final rule requires that a full resolution plan submitted by a Group A CIDI must include an end-to-end strategy for the resolution of the bank pursuant to a reasonable scenario. The identified strategy would be required to address the formation and stabilization of a bridge depository institution that would continue operations of the failed bank and preserve franchise value, unless the filer identifies another strategy that best meets the credibility standards set in the rule. A closing weekend sale, however, would not be permitted as the identified strategy in the resolution plan. We recognize that in certain actual failure scenarios, an over-the-weekend sale may be the most effective strategy to meet the goals of resolution, and the rule does, therefore, seek information and capabilities that would enable a rapid sale. However, we also recognize that this option is likely to be unavailable in many scenarios for banks of this size and complexity. For these CIDIs, the pool of possible acquirers is limited, and transactions may be complex, involve long timelines, or could require accepting significant costs to complete a rapid sale. For that reason, the final rule requires information and analysis that would support other options in recognition that an actual failure may take place under a wide range of scenarios. The final rule would require a 3-year submission cycle for most CIDIs. This is a change from the proposed biennial cadence. Staff recommends this approach, which will allow more time for robust firm-specific engagement and horizontal capabilities testing, and will contribute to the FDIC's resolution planning and readiness. Interim supplements will be required in the off years to address material changes since the previous submission and to provide updates to limited key metrics where information may be more dynamic. The proposed approach for biennial submissions is retained only for CIDIs that are affiliated with U.S. global systemically important banking organizations, or GSIBs. This more frequent schedule is appropriate for these CIDIs, which are the largest, most complex, and most systemically important. This cycle is complementary to the biennial filing cycle applicable to the U.S. GSIB's Dodd-Frank Act Title I resolution plans, and will improve efficiency for the FDIC in connection with review of both resolution plans, as well as for the firm's preparation of the 2 different plans. The final rule retains the proposed 2-prong credibility standard. The first prong would apply only to the credibility of the identified strategy and thus only to the Group A CIDIs. The second prong would apply to both Group A resolution plans and Group B informational filings. It would require that all information and analysis in a resolution submission be based upon observable and verifiable capabilities and data and reasonable projections. Any finding of non-credibility by the FDIC must be supported by the identification of one or more weaknesses in the resolution submission. In response to comments, the final rule provides for tiered levels of feedback and introduces the concept of a significant finding as a level of feedback between informal observations and a finding of a material weakness that would require timely corrective action. A significant finding, if not remediated, could become a material weakness. This approach, which is informed by similar practice under the Dodd-Frank Act Resolution Plan rule, recognizes the utility of feedback to a CIDI that conveys varying levels of urgency. Content elements other than strategy required for the resolution submissions include items such as detailed information about organizational structure and cross-border operations, the identification of separable franchise components, and the establishment of a virtual data room, and identification of contracts, services, and key personnel necessary to continue operations in a bridge depository institution or to support receivership functions. These are largely retained as proposed, with some modifications to streamline, to clarify, or in some cases to enhance the particular elements in response to comments. The informational filings required of Group B CIDIs would have reduced content relative to the submissions from Group A CIDIs. In particular, informational filings would not require a resolution strategy based upon a failure scenario. In addition, Group B CIDIs would not be required to demonstrate capabilities with respect to valuation analysis, a required element of the full resolution plan submissions. Following a review of all comments, some changes were made to the proposed information requirements for Group B CIDI submissions, particularly with respect to the requirements for information relating to franchise components of these CIDIs. Staff believes that this approach is appropriate, recognizing that banks with between $50 and $100 billion in total assets play an important role in the U.S. banking system and require significant advanced resolution planning. At the same time, the final rule recognizes that not all elements included in the resolution plans required of the Group A CIDIs would have the same benefits for resolution planning for the Group B CIDIs. I'd like to hand off here to my colleague, Dora Douglas-Kochman, who will discuss additional information about the rule and our plans to implement it.
The final rule would establish expectations regarding engagement between the CIDIs and the FDIC, which would allow additional focus on areas relevant to resolution of a particular CIDI. This interaction can benefit the CIDI by informing future resolution submissions and the FDIC by enhancing our preparedness to resolve the bank in the event of its failure. Similarly, the rule would establish expectations with respect to capabilities testing, which will be a valuable means to assess and validate capabilities described in the resolution submissions. These capabilities include those necessary for the timely creation of a virtual data room to market the CIDI and its components, and capabilities to allow for continuity of operations necessary in resolution, such as identification of key personnel or the ability to timely produce critical reports. The effective date of the rule is expected to be October 1st. Should the board adopt this final rule, staff will promptly distribute letters to each CIDI notifying it of the due date of its first resolution submission, so as to provide as much lead time as possible for the preparation of the submissions. The implementation of the final rule will require the FDIC to undertake a range of actions in administering its requirements. To ensure that the most important decisions are reserved to the board while facilitating the efficient administration of the role, staff recommends a tiered approach to delegations. Under this approach, key decisions with respect to a finding that a plan is not credible due to one or more material weaknesses, and any enforcement actions, as well as any decision to materially alter the timing of submissions, are reserved to the board. The second tier of decisions, those with respect to significant findings, waiver of particular requirements for full resolution submissions, or requiring additional content elements in the interim supplements, would be reserved to the directors of DRR and CISR, subject to the requirement of advanced consultation with the board. Quarterly reporting to the board would be required for any other delegated actions taken for the ongoing administration of the program, and all actions taken under delegated authority would be subject to the concurrence by the General Counsel or their delegate. Thank you very much for your attention to this rulemaking, and we're happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Good, thank you very much. That was very helpful. I have a statement, and then I'll turn to the other members of the board. The FDIC Board is considering today a final rule to revise the resolution plan regulation for insured depository institutions under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. The FDIC published a notice of proposed rulemaking last September aimed at improving the effectiveness of resolution plans submitted under the current resolution plan rule. That rule has been in effect since 2012. Today's final rule would retain key provisions as proposed, which were designed to demonstrate how the covered insured depository institution might be resolved in an orderly and efficient manner and set clear expectations for their content. The FDIC received a number of thoughtful comments on the NPR, and in response to commenters, the final rule includes targeted changes to the proposal. These changes primarily relate to the timing of submissions and the process of review and feedback to the covered insured depository institutions to improve future submissions and enhance resolvability. Each insured depository institution has the best understanding of the value and operations of its franchise, and its development of a resolution strategy provides an essential input for the FDIC's planning for a quick and effective response if the bank were to fail. Thus, the final rule retains the proposed approach for the development of a resolution strategy by the largest insured depository institutions, those with at least $100 billion in total assets. The development of such a strategy, together with the supporting information and analysis, will materially improve the ability of the FDIC to prepare for and execute resolutions of the largest banks in a manner that preserves stability in the banking system and reduces costs to the Deposit Insurance Fund and other stakeholders. In light of our experience in the spring of last year, the need for strengthened resolution plans for institutions in this category is compelling. While a rapid sale to a single acquirer may be an option at the time of failure, it may not always be possible or may require accepting significant costs to facilitate it. Therefore, the final rule retains the proposed requirement that the strategy developed in the resolution plans of the largest banks not be dependent on a sale executed over the weekend following the institution's failure. It generally requires the bank to explain how it could be placed into a bridge depository institution, how operations could continue when separated from its parent and parent affiliates, and the actions that would be needed to stabilize a bridge depository institution. Institutions with assets under $100 billion can also present resolution challenges. While the final rule does not require full resolution plans from covered insured depository institutions with between $50 and $100 billion in total assets, it does require submission of information and analysis to inform the FDIC's development of options to resolve such banks in a range of scenarios. The requirements applicable to all insured depository institutions covered by the rule include the demonstration of the capabilities necessary to support the marketing of the institution and its assets by the FDIC. This includes the capability to promptly establish a virtual due diligence data room and populate it with information necessary for interested parties to submit well-informed bids for all or parts of the institution. All covered insured depository institutions are expected to engage with the FDIC to assess and test their resolution capabilities, including those that ensure the continuation of critical banking services and the potential marketing of the IDI's franchise or its components. In response to comments, the final rule provides for submissions every 3 years for most covered insured depository institutions, together with interim supplements in the off years that update the most timely information that would be critical if the institution were to fail. As compared to the proposed 2-year submission cycle, a triennial or 3-year cycle supports the priority to provide each covered insured depository institution timely and fulsome feedback, and to ensure sufficient time between resolution submissions for engagement and capabilities testing. Covered IDIs that are affiliated with USG SIBs will be on a 2-year cycle, as they are part of the largest and most systemic and interconnected U.S. banking organizations. This 2-year cycle mirrors the biennial cycle for these banking organizations' living wills submitted pursuant to Title I of the Dodd-Frank Act. Like the proposal, the final rule provides a clear credibility standard for the FDIC's review of full resolution submissions. We expect this clarity will help the banks understand the FDIC's expectations and facilitate an effective review process. As set forth in the final rule, findings of one or more material weaknesses would support a determination of non-credibility. After considering both the comments on the proposal and the approach taken in reviews and feedback for the Title I living wills, the final rule introduces an intermediate level of feedback that requires correction with an appropriate level of urgency, i.e., significant findings. Unlike material weaknesses, the intermediate level feedback would not trigger the immediate corrective action requirement. However, a significant finding, if not remediated, could become a material weakness. Other refinements from the proposal include changes to improve and clarify expectations for certain content requirements and a further narrowing of the requirements for submissions by banks with total assets between $50 and $100 billion. I support this final rule, recognizing that a clear, consistent, and robust resolution planning requirement for large insured depository institutions provides a much stronger foundation for their orderly resolution. I would like to take this opportunity to mention 2 other actions that the FDIC board took at the same time that this NPR was adopted last year. The FDIC, acting in conjunction with the Federal Reserve and the Comptroller of the Currency, also adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking to establish a requirement for eligible long-term debt to be held by large insured depository institutions to support optionality and resolution. In addition, the FDIC approved proposed revised guidance for Dodd-Frank Act resolution plans submitted by certain large banks acting in coordination with the Federal Reserve. Work continues on both of those important initiatives. Finally, I would like to thank the FDIC staff for their thoughtful and dedicated work on this important rulemaking to improve resolution planning for insured depository institutions under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act. That concludes my statement. Vice Chairman Hill.
Thanks, Chairman. Although today's final rule on resolution planning for large IDIs makes certain improvements over the proposal, I plan to vote no. When the FDIC revised its approach to IDI resolution planning 3 years ago, we focused on obtaining, quote, the information most relevant to the FDIC's resolution readiness, end quote, and engaging with IDIs on this information over the course of a 3-year submission cycle. While the spring 2023 bank failures demonstrated a few lessons for IDI resolution planning, such as the importance of being capable of quickly establishing a virtual data room, the final rule goes far beyond those lessons and sets forth detailed content requirements for written plans. For example, all Group A CIDIs, which are IDIs with $100 billion or more in assets, will be required to develop and include in their plan submissions hypothetical failure scenarios and provide detailed valuation information for franchise components and the IDI franchise as a whole, including under the failure scenario assumed. I am skeptical that the expected benefit of such information in a hypothetical resolution justifies the cost of producing them, and generally support shifting our focus more toward firm engagement and away from increasingly detailed plan submissions. With respect to the plan submission cycles, I support the move from a 2-year to a 3-year cycle for Group A CIDIs that are not affiliated with GSIBs. As I noted in response to the proposal, a 2-year cycle was not realistic if the FDIC expects to provide constructive feedback on plans and meaningfully engage with firms each cycle. Still, I think it would have been helpful to provide more structure and process around engagement and capabilities testing, as was provided in the 2021 statement. Additionally, I believe that any resolution planning requirements for firms with less than $100 billion in assets should be significantly more streamlined and focused than they are in the final rule. Finally, I continue to believe that the credibility determinations under the new framework are too subjective and transform what should be a less formal, iterative process into a crude and binary assessment of CIDI's resolution readiness. Although I appreciate the addition of the significant finding category to describe certain concerns that do not rise to the level of a material weakness, I continue to think that providing specific feedback on particular issues as they arise is a better approach than thumbs up, thumbs down votes on entire plans. I will vote against the rule, but would like to express my thanks to the staff for their continued engagement on these issues.
Thank you. Director McKiernan.
Thank you, Chairman. I certainly agree with you, Chairman, that the events of spring 2023 establish a strong case for enhancements to our resolution framework. As I've said, our decision last year to invoke the so-called systemic risk exception was really a profound admission that we have a long ways to go to have an effective framework for resolving our large failed banks. And so I do wish I could support this rule. I won't be able to support it, though, because I don't think we have some of the key authorities we would need to prescribe and enforce some of its requirements. As I said in my dissent on the proposed rulemaking, I think we're generally on solid legal ground to the extent we're requiring resolution-related information. I'm not persuaded, however, that we have the authority to require banks to demonstrate the contemplated resolution-related capabilities or to impose the contemplated restrictions on the resolution strategies. Maybe another way to put this is if we have this authority to enforce this rule, we also have the authority to compel very significant changes in the bank's business models. I think, Congress would have been clear if we were supposed to have that authority as it relates to resolution. Now, again, these changes may make good sense as a policy matter, but that is, of course, a question distinct from our legal authorities. If my legal views always agree or align with my policy views, then I've got a problem of intellectual honesty. So I think it's important that each of us, at least where the courts have not spoken, take a close look at our authorities and come to our own view as to whether we have the authority to impose a certain set of requirements. Done that here, just don't think we've got the authority to do this. Wish I could support the rule. Instead, I'd suggest that maybe Congress should take a closer look at the FDIC's authorities to prescribe resolution requirements at the IDI level. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Director Sue.
Thank you, Chairman. As a longtime regulator of large financial institutions, I know firsthand the consequences of complacency when it comes to resolvability. And those consequences can include not just disorderly failure, but also the need for extraordinary government action, but also the broader loss of trust in banks and their regulators. And it is on us to remain vigilant to safeguard that trust, and this final rule does that. I've got more extended comments. I'll just put those into the record as part of a news release, of a statement I'll put out. I just like to skip to, importantly, that the final rule requires that CIDIs be able to demonstrate the capabilities necessary to ensure that the franchise components, such as asset portfolios or lines of business, are marketable in resolution. For example, submissions must describe capabilities to establish virtual data room in a timely manner. Such capabilities would greatly improve not only the likelihood of orderly resolution, but also the chances of recovery when banks are in stress. And so for these reasons, I support the final rulemaking to revise the IDI resolution plan rule, and I really want to thank staff for all the work they've done on this.
Thank you, Director Chopra.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks for the presentation. I wanted to just highlight and ask a couple questions to emphasize some of the things in your presentation. So as you mentioned, the final rule is really not a new requirement. We're amending the rules and revamping an old one. I wonder if you could just refresh a little bit on the timeline and history. And can you detail when we first required these plans? And the reason why I ask is I just want to make sure it's clear what information and plans did we have during the failures of Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, and Signature?
Thank you for that question. The IDI plan rule that's currently in place was originally approved in 2011 with an effective date of January 1, 2012. Plans were received in several submission cycles over the years since 2012, with several rounds of feedback and guidance to the bank. Following the 2018 submissions, the board imposed a moratorium on plan submissions pending rulemaking to explore improvements to the rule. An advance notice of proposed rulemaking was published in 2019 to further that effort. In January 2021, the FDIC board lifted the moratorium on the resolution plan requirements for covered IDIs with $100 billion or more in total assets, while leaving the moratorium in place for banks under $100 billion. In June of that year, the FDIC issued a policy statement to describe the planned implementation of the rule going forward. Pursuant to that policy, exemptions were provided for certain content elements to all CIDIs, and additional exemptions were provided to certain CIDIs based on their particular characteristics. A schedule was established for submission of plans in 2022 and 2023. As we all recall and has been mentioned here, 3 large banks failed precipitously in the spring of 2023, following bank runs of unprecedented speed and volume. In this situation, robust resolution plans to support advanced planning would have been particularly valuable had they been available. Silicon Valley Bank had only recently met the $100 billion total asset threshold and filed its first plan a few months before its failure. While the information in the plan was limited, it was helpful, particularly with respect to the bank's organizational structure and cross-border activities. Signature Bank also had only recently crossed the $100 billion mark, but it failed just months before the date its first plan was due. First Republic Bank had filed a plan in 2018, but it was a very different institution then. It was significantly smaller and simpler. Its first plan, following its growth beyond the $100 billion threshold, would have been due soon after its failure. While staff had been working on the notice of proposed rulemaking that was approved by this board last August, we had been working on that well before the March 2023 failures, but those failures underscored the importance of advanced resolution planning. The FDIC's experience in managing those resolutions informed some of the particular content requirements that we've included in this rule today.
Let me add what was not described in the presentation but has been a discussion among some of us is the issue of least cost test. Least cost test is something that we have to calculate very rapidly. And to the extent that we have information about alternatives, that might actually inform that least cost test very significantly. We all know that there is, in the context of a bidding process for an institution that has failed or is failing, the due diligence process is one that is extremely truncated. And for a complex institution, that means that any bidder is going to apply quite a significant discount because of those uncertainties. So I really do think it is important for us to be armed with the range of information, just as any sound investment banker would be thinking through that process. I wonder, and I'm sorry I didn't share this in advance, I wonder if you could share a little bit more about how the plans, I think this is in the board memo, will also inform even our least cost test.
Thank you for that question. One of the elements of the submission is a requirement that the CIDI be in a position to demonstrate certain valuation capabilities that will enable it to support analysis of various the various options in front of the FDIC at the time. So the final rule would require demonstration of capabilities to value the franchise as a whole under various scenarios and to value identified franchise components or asset portfolios if they were to be offered separately for sale. So this, we think, is a valuable tool to understand the complexities of the valuation analysis that you've referred to, Director Chopra, and will make us more ready to do that analysis across a range of scenarios that we can't advance fully, we can't determine fully in advance.
Yeah, and I think this is not in the Federal Register notice, but the strength of that information actually can make the difference of billions of dollars when it comes to actual bids that we receive and achieving a least cost to the Deposit Insurance Fund. I'll just read this brief statement today. The FDIC is considering amendments to its rules regarding the resolution plans required of very large banks with $50 billion or more in assets. The rules will require these banks to submit plans to the FDIC demonstrating how they could be wound down without a costly mega merger. When a community bank fails, the FDIC can market the failed bank to a range of potential acquirers and sell it to the highest bidder. Even if this process takes more time than desired, the risks to the broader financial system and the cost to the Deposit Insurance Fund are fairly minimal usually. The story can be much different for a very large bank. First, there's typically a smaller pool of potential bidders that would be able to purchase the firm. Second, very large banks are often more complex. The smaller pool of potential bidders will face more unknowns without the ability to conduct significant due diligence over a reasonable period of time. And most importantly, failures of very large banks can immediately invite concern about contagion in the financial system. All of these factors tend to lead to an outcome where the FDIC sales a failed bank to an even bigger one with huge costs to the Deposit Insurance Fund. Plans submitted pursuant to these rules will help the FDIC pursue other strategies, such as breaking up a failed bank into valuable components and selling it to multiple buyers or spinning the failed bank back out into private hands through an offering or other transaction. The rule also includes capabilities testing requirements to make sure banks have the capacity to execute these alternative strategies. For example, can the bank quickly supply the information necessary to open a virtual data room for bidders to conduct due diligence? Has the bank thought through and addressed personnel, IT infrastructure, and contractual obstacles to breaking up the firm into pieces in order to sell it for the maximum possible value? In conclusion, I support today's rule amendments. The required plans will help us reduce costs to the Deposit Insurance Fund, mitigate the risk of contagion, and reduce the creep of concentration in our banking sector. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further comments or questions. May I have a motion to approve the final rule?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. I'll now call the roll for the vote on the final rule. I vote aye. Vice Chairman Hill?
No.
Director McKiernan?
No.
Director Sue?
Aye.
Director Chopra?
Aye.
The motion is adopted. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much to the staff.
Thank you. Oops.
For the next item in our agenda, Vice Chairman Hill will present a proposal regarding board briefings on certain merger and deposit insurance applications outstanding for more than 270 days. Vice Chairman Hill.
Thanks, Chairman. So I proposed two items for votes at the board meeting today. One is related to applications, which is what we're going to discuss now. And a second one is related to office expansion, which we're going to discuss as part of the closed meeting because it may touch on certain non-public items. But I did just want to very briefly mention it right now. The FDIC is expecting to undertake a variety of projects in the near future related to expanding our office footprint, and that includes things like lease expansions, construction, furnishing, things like that. And based on the numbers that I've seen, the costs are expected to exceed $60 million. And I feel like this is something that we should not be deciding right now, so my proposal would be to suspend the authority to spend funds or commit to spend funds on these projects until a new chairman is sworn in or until the board acts otherwise. But I know we'll discuss that more in the closed meeting, so more to come on that. So this item that we're going to discuss now is related to applications, and this is motivated by the fact that for certain applications, our process is taking too long. And this is a problem that has worsened noticeably in the past couple of years. And to illustrate this, if we look at merger and deposit insurance applications that have been outstanding for more than 9 months, so that's from the time we initially receive it until final action, from 2013 to 2021, there was not a single year in which there were 10 or more such applications that crossed that 270-day threshold in a single year. Since then, we've hit double digits every year since 2022. There were 12 in 2022, 16 in 2023, and in 2024, we have essentially already hit 11 halfway through the year, with 10 more currently pending that are past that threshold and more likely on the way. With respect to large mergers, in 2019 and 2021, we approved 2 mergers that resulted in institutions with more than $100 billion in assets, each of which took less than 9 months. Since 2022, by contrast, we've approved 3 mergers that resulted in institutions with between 10 and approximately $50 billion in assets that have taken more than a year. A long application review process is costly for a variety of reasons. In the case of mergers, it adds uncertainties for employees and customers. It makes post-merger integration more challenging, and it can be dangerous if one of the merging entities is in a vulnerable condition. So what I have proposed would establish a requirement that for any merger or deposit insurance application that crosses that 270-day mark, it would automatically be put on the agenda at the next board meeting. And as long as the application remained outstanding, it would continue to be put on the agenda for board meetings on a quarterly basis. And staff would be required to come brief the full board, and those briefings would be required to include, among other things, a detailed timeline of the steps that have been taken since the application was initially received, and a description of the steps that still needed to be taken along with associated timeframes. And the purpose of this is twofold. One purpose is to give the board more regular and rigorous oversight over the process. And the second, which is kind of the more fundamental objective, is to try to encourage faster processing of applications. So I appreciate the board's consideration and turn it back to the chairman.
Thank you. I have a very brief statement, and then I'll turn to the other members of the board. I know that FDIC staff work diligently to process these applications in a timely way. I also believe that it would be helpful for staff to brief the board on applications that require longer than normal processing so that the board can gain an understanding on the reasons for that. And so for that reason, I'm prepared to support the proposal put forward by the Vice Chairman. Director McKiernan?
No, let me just commend the Vice Chair for raising the issue and suggest that I'll enthusiastically support the proposal.
Thank you. Director Sue?
I'm supportive.
Director Chopra?
Well, I appreciate this being brought up. Let me just share that by way of my assessment of how the banking agencies tend to review and dispose of applications, I think there can be a sense that the banking agencies are not willing to deny applications. And I think the result of this is an endless game of footsie between the agencies and the applicants. Often we hear this over and over and over again, where there are clear concerns that are communicated by the staff. Rather than putting the application through for the board or leadership to issue a denial, we go through an endless iteration to determine how we can all twist ourselves into a pretzel to get to yes for sometimes facially deficient applications. We have denied the public with any real benefit about the reasons for those denials and have not been willing, in some cases, to stand up to judicial scrutiny of it. So I really think this is good. I think this is a way that we can get applications processed and have those denials be public. That will provide a lot of benefit to the public about how we are looking at this, where the concerns are, so that future applicants can know what should be expected of them. There is almost no litigated case law with respect to much of the application disposition. And I think there is a reputation that the agencies approve every single application, and that's actually not true. We see a number of withdrawals that do occur, and those withdrawals come with almost no transparency about what the agency's concerns are. So I want to thank you, Vice Chairman Hill, for raising this, and I do think hopefully this will get us to a place of a policy where we can swiftly deny applications that are facially deficient or not substantially complete. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate our agreement, but I'm not sure we agree on all the underlying objectives here, but thanks.
Okay. There's no further comment on this proposal. May I have a motion with respect to the proposal presented by Vice Chairman Hill?
So moved.
Thank you. In a second?
Second.
I'll now call the roll for the vote. I vote aye. Vice Chairman Hill?
Aye.
Director McKiernan?
Aye.
Director Sue?
Aye.
Director Chopra?
Aye.
The motion is adopted. And that concludes the open discussion agenda for today's meeting. If there's no other business that any member would like to bring forward, we'll now adjourn this open meeting and we'll move into a closed session. Thank you all very much.
Would you mind if we could just go to